Hey, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar. I'm going to spend about the next 40 minutes to an hour talking about leadership seizure, and that might be a title that you're unfamiliar with, not come across before, and that's fine. I'm going to give some explanation behind that as we go through. Essentially, how to lead under prolonged exposure to pressure. And if you'll allow me, I'm going to be your coach for the next hour and maybe challenge your thinking. But just before we get underway, let's just make sure everybody can hear me. So just familiarize yourself with the Zoom panel and put your hand up if you can hear me. That's good. See some hands going up there. Great as well. Putting the hands up also helps just in terms of that level of engagement. Also find your chat box, pop into the chat whereabouts you are. It's always good to know how far we've got to reach in terms of these webinars that we put out. It's just a great way. And it's also a nice way of me knowing then that you have found the chat box, so we can help field any questions. In 2008, my regiment, I'm a veteran, served for 24 or 28 years, 8 years ago, I left as I started my coaching practice. But in 2008, my regiment was deployed to Afghanistan, to a place called Nadi Ali. Not the nicest of places in terms of the friendly people that you're going to meet, but a beautiful place in terms of a desert landscape and the Afghani people, amazing. We were taken over from an organization called the 27th Marine Expeditionary Unit, United States Marine Corps, USMC. The organization was some 4 times the size of our battalion, with internal assets that we could only ever see as being, external in terms of, maybe the RAF and artillery and such. They had assets of, air support, close air support and artillery all within their ranks. 27th MEU kind of epitomized having, the support and the might of the US right behind them. And they were massive. They were something to behold, that was for sure. Now, at the time, I was the regimental sergeant major. That might not mean much to many of you on the call today. That essentially I was the most senior enlisted soldier in our battalion. So at the top of the tree at that point in many respects. And I was the confident and often the right-hand man and the ear to our commanding officer. Now, we arrived in theatre in order to build relationships. We arrived early in order to build the relationships with the outgoing American forces, their command sergeant major, who is my equivalent, and their commanding officer. And we spent some, 2-3 weeks together, so that the transference of operational command went seamlessly. Now, one of our platoons assumed command of the most southerly patrol base in Afghanistan at the time. The platoon was about 35 to 40 troops strong. And incidentally, that wasn't just men. The medics that were in that platoon, in that troop, were females. So we had a mix. And they took over the base, which incidentally was a converted, I don't like to use the phrase mud hut, but the Afghanis build these amazing dwellings out of the desert. And that's what it kind of was. And then we created a fortress around it with what's called Hesco Bastion. Now, what was interesting is the company took over from about 90 Marines from the USMC. So we sent a platoon in to do a company's job. That's the first thing just to bear in mind. This was the most southerly patrol base in Afghanistan at that time. And it was called and nicknamed Banshee. Little did we realize at that time how apt that name was to become. Now, through today's session, I'm going to share with you some insights into dealing with pressure. I'm going to share with you a bit of my own personal experience from my military experience and what I'd witnessed. Now, there's no doubt that everybody has been exposed to prolonged pressure pretty much since the 23rd of March last year. I want to share with you today actually what some of the causes are of that pressure and why that pressure has a different impact on us in different ways. I want to share with you actually some of the methods and methodology that you can actually apply to start to deal with pressure in a new way. and start to actually, I guess, in many respects, take control of how that pressure turns up and manifests in your daily life. We'll talk a little bit about fear and an insight into actually how the brain works. Now, I'm not a psychiatrist or neurosurgeon, but I've understood enough to know kind of why we do things the way we do them. Pretty intrinsic for me being a coach to be able to understand a few of these things. And I want to share that with you because I think it's important for us to understand why we do the things we do. Now, I want to combine with that at the end is to give you some habits and practices that high performers adopt. And let's be clear, when we're talking about leadership seizure and we're talking about the impact of pressure, and in this case, what it has been to have prolonged exposure to pressure. The other side of this one, it's about high performance. Now, one of the things to note here and something to be aware of is that, there is no performance without pressure. And I can tell you that from my own experience as a high performance coach, both today and through my military career when I was a master coach, that in order to get the optimal performance from anybody, there needs to be pressure. Now, you'll have many of your own examples of that, and I'm just going to share with you a couple of my examples. You'll have all seen and heard of the SAS and SAS selection, where you go away to do that. They are incredibly clever at how they put pressure together to take someone to a place that they've never been before in terms of that inner resolve, drive, and commitment to get through it. And the point of reference here is that, actually getting through that pressure, we come out, with a higher level of understanding of what we're capable of achieving. And to be fair, the way in which we have faced and dealt with and got through, these challenging times for many people, as we now approach almost 12 months, will be the direct attributing factor to why they're in a better place. Now, hopefully that makes sense with you so far. The challenge which many business leaders, executive and business owners face today is that prolonged exposure to pressure and really a lack of preparation for its impact. None of us would have known that this time last year we would have gone through, what it's been 3 different lockdowns, the disruption to our daily life, the introduction to other challenges, the homeschooling. Now, all of these have been areas where we have had to deal with in different ways that exposure to pressure. The reality of this is pressure puts us on significant mental demand on our body. And it's then how do we fight through and deal with that situation that we are faced with? How does that pressure turn up? So I think pressure and performance, the point here is accept the fact that we're going to live in pressure and that we've got this notion of, cause and effect. And if we see pressure as an opportunity to expand who we are and what we can do, it's going to be one major step towards actually being able to deal with that as and when it turns up. And I'm going to pick up on this as a bit of a thread as we go through this afternoon to give you more insight. Okay, so here's a question for you. Has anybody been perturbed during this last 12 months? And I guess you'll all understand what I mean by being perturbed, somewhat maybe annoyed, frustrated, upset, whatever that looks like. Anybody been perturbed through the last 12 months? Perturbation. Let me just introduce you to perturbation. We've all heard of perturbed. When we're perturbed with something, there is an emotional response to us. Now, perturbation's a scientific term, and I'm not going to necessarily stand up in court and give you the scientific rigor and insight to this definition. But this is as I understand it, and this is as we utilize this analogy within the business coaching world and the performance coaching world. So perturbation is the response of a matter to an external pressure. So in this case, what you can see is boiling water. Now, boiling water is created when we apply heat to it. So you add heat to water, it starts to get perturbed. And then perturbation is the point that it breaks through and changes into a different form. So it breaks through what we were telling, I think it's called the meniscus, the top layer of water, and then we start to see steam coming off, and that's perturbation. So how does this analogy work with us? Well, what are the external pressures, the external influences that create that perturbation in you? What are those external pressures and those external influences that create that shift in your state? Now, the challenge with this is often that state is, it's an emotional outburst. It's something that, we go through this shift in our state and probably get angry or frustrated, anxiety, anxious, whatever that might look like. The result is that change in state. Some external pressure has created an internal, disruption to us, and then it pops out as an emotion. And we term that as perturbation in the coaching world, and certainly within Action Coach. And the point here is that perturbation is, actually, how do I respond to that? How do I recognize that I'm in perturbation? How do I recognize that I am perturbed? The mind is an amazing thing. Our brains are such complex and amazing organ in our body that, sometimes this stuff goes undetected because of our self-conscious. So as we're going through this afternoon, I want you to just think about, actually, what is it that creates that perturbation for me? What is it that creates that shift in my state? What are the triggers that trigger me to get anxious, fearful, worried, concerned? All of those emotions that generally turn up when we start to feel that pressure exert itself on us. And in going back to the title of today's session, it's where it creates that seizure in leadership. And as we go through, hopefully I'll give you a little bit more insight to this. So thinking about perturbation, I want you now to think about this wonderful looking chap powering down a forest path towards you. How do you react? How do you react? You see, this dog, just growling and snarling 50 meters away, powering down towards you. Just pop into the chat. What's your reaction? What feelings does that evoke? I mean, I'm just looking at the picture now, and it's evoking those feelings in me. What does that do for you? What type of responses do you have? How do you think your mind responds? So, the point here is this is fear in its rawest terms, and it's created by this I guess the sudden appearance of this snarling dog coming tearing down the path to you. That suddenly creates that fear. Now, the point on this one is your brain reacts so quickly to this. It's nanoseconds that suddenly we're into that, fight, freeze, or flight mode. And that's kind of, I'm going to touch on that a little later, but that's kind of where we are. And that's the rawness of fear. So what's that got to do with a golf ball? Well, here you go. I want you to picture this scene. And I apologize if you're not a golfer, but it's a great analogy. You're at the tee, you're teeing off, and between you and the green is a water obstacle. But you're teeing off, and you're currently the leader of the championship. And there is maybe a few £1,000s in prize money at stake here. Now, the reality for you, if you're a golfer, and you can set this analogy to any sport you want. You might be a football player taking a penalty, and it's that penalty is going to be the win or lose of the match. It could be that you're, doing a conversion in rugby. Whatever the circumstances are, it's that same feeling of fear will come in. Now, whilst we might not have got bitten and we might not die from this, the emotive response, the physiological responses in our body are the same. Yet the interesting point here is that, fear isn't equal. Now, the point here is that we have some old inherited, if you will, functions in our brain, which I'll talk about in a little while, which create this fear response, this pressure, our response to external pressures. But you can all see that actually playing that golf shot, the fear isn't the same. It's not equal to the fear of actually that dog powering down the street. Yet we all suffer from those circumstances. And sometimes you probably can't differentiate the fear from one to the other. Yet it seems irrational. And it's because of the way we respond. Now, I term it myself as interference. If you think about it, when does that interference kick in for you? Now, this might be that, it's a business meeting. It could be sales. And there's a great one out there. And, I often talk to people on the sales side of life and, suddenly the fear of picking up the phone, it manifests all of those same responses in our mind, and they turn up in our body in that physiological response to actually picking up the phone. And we do everything we can to get away from it. We fight, we freeze, we get out of the room, we try to distance ourselves from it. Now, if you think about the logic of that, it doesn't make any sense, does it? But this is the way that the pressure of what we've been through over the last 12 months is going to manifest itself. Now, as a leader, what type of impact will that have? As a leader, what type of clarity do you have in order to actually to lead your teams and your people through those challenging times? Anxiety, what causes it? What is the root cause of that fear for you in business, in your position as a leader? Or what have you witnessed over this period of time in other leaders? I just want to bring up the next element that is quite interesting when we start to look at this in the context of interference, and it's the negative bias. Okay, so the negative bias, I think it's fair to say that over the past 12 months, we have seen an awful lot of that in the news. And indeed, many people that I talk to, find themselves in a place where they're actually avoiding actually now watching the news because of these challenges. So when we think about this, the news gives us it almost seems like the negative account of what's going on at the moment. How many people have sadly perished as a result of COVID-19, how poorly certain business sectors are operating or being able to function, what we can't do, what we won't do, and it creates this whole negative atmosphere out there in terms of what's going on. So the interesting point on this one, when we start to identify this negative bias, is how does it turn up in you? Because it will start to preset your subconscious. You'll start to tune into that. It may be that actually, here's a great example today. Rishi Sunak presented the budget. Now, what's your frame of reference? If you've looked and listened to what he said, have you got a positive frame of reference to the budget, or actually have you got a negative frame of reference to the budget? Do you feel that actually everything that he suggested is actually there's some focus there in terms of actually getting us through and beyond this, or was it all actually all bad news? Now, the interesting point on this one is when you start to understand and you recognize and can reflect on that moment that interference comes in, and you can see it turning up as negative bias, then you can start to do something about it. You can start to control that reaction. Pick up that reaction very early on. Now, what I want to share with you now, if I may, is I want to share a little about the brain. Now, again, I'm not going to profess to be a neuroscientist or a doctor, a biologist. These are the elements that I understand through my own studies as being a coach. But the interesting point in this one is, I think it's important for us to have a bit of an understanding of how our brains work. And I'm going to be sharing a model with you by a chap called Dr. Seri Evans, and it's called the red and blue model, and it's very good. And I'm also going to link that in with another great business model out there, a guy called Professor Stephen Peters, and he talks about the Chimp paradox. I just want to tie that in so that you've got a bit of context to why pressure turns up the way it does. So in terms of the brain itself, let's just have a brief overlook as I go through this one, and then I'll introduce you to the actual how this manifests itself in the red and blue brain. So brainstem. The brainstem is kind of it's almost got the very core elements of our subconscious ability to look for safety and to look out for safety. It reacts incredibly quickly in terms of processing that data. Now here's an interesting point for you that whilst you want to think about how much your brain actually operates, I think that there is a reality here that I think they suggest 95% of your brain is subconscious, operating in the subconscious, and that's kind of where your brain stem, the safety side life, and your limbic system, the emotions, they are constantly beavering away in the background. Easy way to test that theory is stop and think about why are you breathing? Do you think about breathing? Why can you actually consciously feel and think about your heart beating and slow it down or speed it up? You can't, because we don't want to be tied down with those challenges. So you can start to see it's a very complex organ in terms of the way the brain functions, and we've got a number of levels here. So level one is that brainstem. Level two is the limbic system, where it focuses on their emotions. We've got the cerebral cortex, which is responsible for our learning, and then we've got the corpus callosum, which actually binds the two hemispheres of the brain together, which we'll have a quick look at here. Now, the two hemispheres, this is where we start to look at this model of how our brains actually function and how it works in collaboration. So the right hemisphere is about the here and the now, and then the left hemisphere is about the deliberate, slower, conscious decisions that we make. In many respects, we're looking at the right hemisphere with regards to the immediate safety, with regards to how the world is around us. I often term it as the creative side, and you probably have seen images of the brain, which one side of it is highly creative, and then the other one's got, and the left hemisphere is all about the numbers. It's about the deliberate focus on matching current situations with past memories, and then it will use language and calculations to match that data with current timelines of what it's experiencing, and creates the stories in relation to those timelines. So we can start to see a logical point here. But the guess, if you think about these two hemispheres and then the limbic system in the middle of the brain, the cerebral cortex, that gives us those three parts. So we've got the left-hand side and we've got the right-hand side. So left-hand side is our blue side and the right-hand side is our red side. You're probably picking up here in regards to what I'm talking about. And incidentally, for those of you that have registered for this, this webinar this afternoon, we will be making not only the recording, but we'll put the PDF of the slides together as well. So you've got it as reference. So moving on from that, then the back of the brain is where we then process that raw sensory data. There's another element at the back of the brain called the reticular activating system, which I often reflect on and talk to in terms of how we program, and that's working both whilst we're awake and asleep, and in our subconscious, and a real key focus there with regards to when we do things like goal setting. Point of reference on that one is it will still filter all of those sensory perceptions that we have, even when you're a dream. So probably the reason that when we have dreams, they feel incredibly realistic, because that's what our brain is telling us. And then we've got the front of the brain, which refines the images through meaning and interpretation. So what does this all mean? Well, let's put it into the simple context here. The right hemisphere, the limbic system, and the brainstem deal with our feelings. It runs our survival, our fight, freeze, and flight. The raw run process. It's our subconscious, which is always monitoring sensory information coming in from our our bodily organs and what we're seeing as well. Clearly, as I mentioned, we don't want to be spending too much time in this area, so we don't want to have to waste brain power in thinking about breathing and thinking about our heartbeats. So it's constantly in the background, monitoring and and that emotional information. The interesting then side on the blue side of the brain is it's dealing with the thinking side of life. And as sentient beings, one of the key characteristics of being a human is the fact that we have this ability to think about thinking, setting goals, learning, and how we can adapt to our situation. Now, the reality here is that the hemispheres of our brain react in different speeds. So the red side of our brain reacts incredibly quickly. I mean, we're talking nanoseconds to threat. Now, you can look at that threat, in any way that you want to, determine it. It might be on the road today, stepping out, and suddenly, you've got a car or a bus powering down towards you. The red side of your brain is the bit that will, pull you back from the road. It will create a massive adrenaline rush, and you've all felt that before, and takes you out and protects you. That's what its role is. The challenge is that today, the responses that we get, the fight, the freeze, and the flight responses that we have, now really account for why we suffer under pressure, why so many people suffer under pressure. And it's really, we can see it turning up in day-to-day life in terms of fight, freeze, and flight. So let me give you an example of this one then. Fight. How does it turn up when we're under pressure? Well, it turns up in an aggressive manner. We can start to see people, and again, as I'll go through this, I've got no doubt you'll have all experienced this yourself, or indeed seen it firsthand in somebody else. Raised voices, threatening behavior, bullying, maybe even being confrontational. What about being insulting? Or rejection and exclusion. And, these are all aggressive behaviors that we would normally associate with the fight response. So in a period of pressure, and then it could be in a board meeting, it could be, on a call, dare I say, with a colleague or a client. It could be any number of activities that you might be undertaking within your role and responsibility as a leader. That suddenly something happens that, the pressure goes up, and that's how you respond. You respond with the fight response, in this case, aggressive. And that, you probably all heard the term passive aggressive. These are crossovers as well. So when we freeze, we're then into this passive response, and again, you may reflect and recognize yourself. There've been occasions where you've just become quiet. Maybe you avoid eye contact. It might be that you're not volunteering for things that you might normally do, or you step back, or maybe even just going through the motions. Now, when we look at it in this respect, again, what we can see in this instance is, that freeze response to pressure, and then we've got the third level, where actually it's about flight. And in this case, it's what we would term as escaping from the situation. We remove ourselves from the situation. It might be that we don't even turn up, or we start to be late, or we call sick. A great one, procrastination, is an incredible, escape response, the flight response. In the extreme circumstances, it could be that we resign from our position of leadership, or we've seen people resign. And what about, lowering our discipline? In a, I guess a sports game, sometimes we see this where, actually the easy escape is to get sent off. Now, what I want you to think about here is I just want you to reflect on the phrase APE. So the reason I want to just get you thinking about that one is because the aggressive response, the passive response, and escape are going to be key in actually how we deal with pressure going forward, how we start to, make sure that we don't allow this to manifest and turn up in our day-to-day life. I want to do a little bit of crossover now with regards to Professor Stephen Peters' Chimp Paradox. Now, so it's a great book, The Inner Chimp. Well, it's actually called The Chimp Paradox, Dr. Stephen Peters. And what he talks about here, you may have also heard it referred to as the reptilian mind or the reptilian brain. And now the point here is that what I've talked about there are, I guess, our flight, our freeze, and our fight response, or fight, freeze, and flight response, is essentially our inner chimp. And our inner chimp is kind of like it's in this cage until something happens. And then when that something happens, we have an immediate response to it. Now, the easiest way to portray this one, and again, just show of hands, who's been in a situation where what's happened is you've been confronted with something, and before you've even thought about a response, you have blurted something out to maybe a loved one and immediately regretted it. Anyone been there? The interesting point here is that that's your chimp at work. And what Dr. Stephen Peters says is, you can't control your chimp. You can't keep it in a cage. It will do what chimps do, and there will be occasions where it will run a little bit rampant. But what we can do is we can manage our chimp. And so one of the things that we've got to do to manage our chimp, and again, this will, I guess, relate very heavily to, when we were children, and our parents used to say to us, pay attention. One of the things that you've got to do through life is just pay attention. And what we need to do is then to get, become, focused on the things that are going to be the triggers for us in those pressure situations. What is it that creates that pressure? And how do we become aware of that pressure building? What is it that we can do to actually, recognize it early enough that we can respond before the chimp does? Now, it might be our environment. It may be the way in which we approach a certain challenge or a problem. The one thing to do is, always remember to pay attention. I guess if you look at it this way, it's almost dealing with the pressure in that present moment. And I'm going to give you a bit more of a focus on that in just a moment. So if we're paying attention, the next bit here is kind of, okay, so we've got to act. We've got to consciously evoke our blue side of the brain. And the point with evoking the blue side of the brain is where we act. And the thing to remember is we have to act on what we see. We get clarity in what it is we're doing, and then there is a task that's associated with it. So what is it that we need to do? What is that act process, the blue brain response? So let me just give you now a bit of a framework on the blue and red brain and how this works and how we can actually work together. So the freeze, flight, and fright, the ape side of life, the aggression, passive, and escape response is actually, we frame it in this reference. When that happens, we recognize it through the word escape. And what we mean by this is actually when we find ourselves in that situation, this is where we can now tune into what those triggers are. Prior to a pressure situation, there's an expectation. That might be something that we're, subconsciously aware of, but, there is an expectation that, okay, there's pressure building. I can sense that pressure building. Now, this may be something that happens in a nanosecond, or it could be over a prolonged period of time. And more often than not, we find ourselves in a place as leaders that we've got this insight. We can see the pressure building. So what is our expectation? Before we perform, people are expecting us to reach a certain standard. And then we've got the what happens, that scrutiny through our performance. So during our performance, there's a level of scrutiny, and that's often, as a leader, something that's very public. And then once that performance is complete, there is then the consequences of what happens. Now, if we can recognize these triggers, what it means is that we can then start to manage the chimp, to manage the external origins of that pressure, and not allow the response of this pressure to, if you excuse the phrase, to go ape, to be aggressive in our response, to have a passive response to it, in terms of hiding away from it or to evade it altogether and escape. So when we look at escape, what we're saying there is, right, what do I need to do to make sure that I'm tuning myself into my environment so much that I'm aware of this? And the more that we get into this process of doing it, the more we program our subconscious, the greater the responses that you're going to have. Does this make sense so far? Just escape is about tuning ourselves in, getting focused on the triggers, making sure that we're tuned into, how we respond to pressure. And that means that we've got to start taking a good look at what that circumstance environment is. So contrary to that, the other side of this one is, what do we do when the pressure is imminent or we're in the moment? So the next piece then is where we talk about impact. So the idea here is that we then start to focus on intention, moment, and priority. Newton's first law states that an object will remain in its current state of motion unless an external force acts on its current trajectory to change its momentum. So what we mean by that is this whole focus that actually, if we are on a pressure, course, if we are, on an escape route, and we're about to dive into that ape and that freeze, fight, and flight, then that nothing's going to change that trajectory unless we start to look at terms of dealing with the pressure. So identifying the intention, what is about to happen, being present in that moment. So being clear, right, this is what's happening right now. What is the priority of my actions? So when it looks at the impact model, we're driven by the intentions instead of being affected by somebody else's scrutiny, where we are and I guess their context of what we're doing in that moment. And then we're looking at, instead of somebody else's consequences, which we focus on in terms of what, the circumstances that we're in, we then focus on, what is the priority for us to get out of this, to manage this pressure situation. Is this making sense? So escape versus impact, that's kind of where we are with this. And I think when we look at it in that respect, it then allows us to, the ability to start to focus with regards to, dealing with these situations, to then start to deal with pressure. Now, I talked at the beginning of this one about exposure to prolonged pressure and how we can deal with prolonged pressure. The point here is, whether it's prolonged pressure or, a once in a while situation we find ourselves in, the point is how we reflect on this internally. What is our thought process run through this? And I think if we look at the two various models of escape versus impact, unless we start to manage and get at that chimp and move away from the freeze, flight, and fight, so the aggressive, passive, and escape model, where that would be our normal response, which just drives us into this doom of pressure and the impact it has on us, the physiological impact it has on us, and actually, the physical impact it has on us, we become less and less capable of dealing with pressure. Whereas if we look at it in the context of impact and dealing with this, and then making sure we've got clarity in terms of how it is that we need to, act, the clarity in the situation, the tasks that we need to undertake, we're not going to actually be able to manage the pressure going forward. And that's for sure. So I said I wanted to share with you a little bit of military methodology. So this guy is called John Boyd. And John Boyd was a US Air Force pilot in the Korean War. So the OODA loop that was created was when they were, flying over Korea and they were getting into air-to-air combat. It struck John Boyd, or Captain Boyd at the time, that they needed a way to be able to get ahead of the enemy's train of thought. How do we advance ourselves to a point where we're actually responding quicker than they are? And what he came up with, and again, look this up on Wikipedia, it says there's a lot on there for it. He came up with the idea of observe, orientate, decide, and act. And again, these are, whilst it sounds lengthy, they're really not. It's kind of observe what's going on. So if you now think about what we've talked about Observe, recognize escape, recognize the chimp is showing itself, recognize the pressure that we are in, orientate ourselves to that situation and think about impact. How are we going to act to get clarity and get a task in place to actually deal with this one? And then we can decide what that course of action is before we then act it out. So this OODA loop, this mindset process is always about, right, okay, what's happening? How do I deal with this? Right, this is a red brain moment right now. Okay, I need to bring the logical blue brain moment in. So how do I do that? I've got to go through an element of orientation in terms of what's happening, where I am, what's doing. And then I've got to make a decision in terms of the blue side of the brain to then act and deal with it. Now, as a veteran and a former soldier of some years, we get trained on how to do this, and over a long period of time, and exposure to it, you almost become quite comfortable with that level of pressure. And sometimes the pressure doesn't dissipate, but what it does, it sharpens up your OODA loop. It sharpens up your ability to orientate yourself and to decide and to make a decision. And that's kind of what we've got to try and do with the pressure that we're experiencing and facing right now. So let me give you a bit of an insight to what high performers, often do. And I'll just read through the list just to give you, a chance to reflect on these. So high performers have the ability to disentangle themselves from things that they can't influence. Hands up, how many of you get tied in something that actually is outside of your control, that you can't deal with, that you've got no influence on, that frustrates you and creates a pressure? Great example is lockdown one. Lockdown one, we got thrown into lockdown, and I do emphasize that because it was literally 23rd one day, 24th we're at home in your office, or you're whatever the case may be, you weren't going into work, and it was outside of our control. So how do we disassociate ourselves with that one in order to then be able to deal with it? So high performers have that ability to immediately orientate themselves to that one. The next piece is have flexibility in handling unanticipated events. So when the proverbial hits the fan, how do we respond? What is it that we can do to actually then deal with that? And that's kind of one area that we can focus on in terms of actually dealing with that element of it. A strong self-awareness. So having a strong self-awareness is something that is really quite impactful in terms of being aware of your environment, understanding the pressures that we're being exposed to, and then being able to determine how we're going to actually be able to deal with those, and going back to that escape model again. A willingness to face uncertain circumstances, the unknown unknowns, as it's often referred to. Having the ability to bounce back from disappointments, I think, is it's a really interesting one. How many of you, hands up, how many of you have been derailed for a period of time after something bad has happened? Now, we're talking in business here, but this can be anything in life, and sometimes it's really hard to get out of that. Sometimes we get ourselves in a rut, and one of the ways that you can look at a rut is it's a grave with no ends. Once we get into that rut, they're sometimes really difficult to get out of. So again, having a real focus in terms of actually, I need to get out of that rut. High emotional intelligence plays a part in all of this, because that's about our own self-awareness and really understanding how our emotions work and turn up each day. And then practice optimism and beyond. Now, the reason I say optimism and beyond is, I guess the way I phrase this is, I am neither an optimist or a pragmatist, but rather I have a real sense that the glass I have isn't big enough. And that way it just always gets me trying to expand my mind, to expand where I am and expand what I want to achieve. So the next piece here is really about the habits of high performers. The habits of high performers. And again, just looking down the list, I know some of you on the call today, practicing positive self-talk. I term it as your daily affirmations. What is it you need to do to reinforce your turning up each and every day? Continue in your training, even if you feel that you are a master of what it is you do. I've been coaching now for some 18 years, and I still am continuing to top up my learning. I'm still driven by I guess a mastery that I can almost never achieve, because I want to learn more. And by learning more, it creates this ever never-ending focus on I guess on personal excellence in that respect. But it allows me a much better ability to deal with, in this case, as we're talking about, that exposure to pressure. Focus on the small wins. Don't just look at the big stuff. Visualize your desired outcomes. Get real clear in terms of where it is you're heading to, so that when you do hit those challenging points, when that pressure is turned on, that you're able to actually, deal with that pressure. And the other element here of habits of high performance is anticipate that everything will go wrong. Murphy's law. And we used to laugh about this in the military. Murphy's law: if it can go wrong, it will go wrong. And there's a great focus here is in any decision or circumstance you find yourself in, whether it's a prolonged, analytical, dive into the circumstances, or whether it is a snapshot of what's going to go on here. You in many respects similar to the OODA loop. You can just look at this in terms of what's the worst case, what's the best case, and what can I live with. Now, as a leader in business, if any decision you make, you just ask yourself those three questions: worst case, best case, and what can I live with? You will really make some very, very powerful decisions going forward. And if you want to dive into that in a little bit more detail, get your pens and jot this down. A guy called Cunningham, I think it's Jonathan Cunningham, has written a book called The Road Less Stupid. The Road Less Stupid, Cunningham. And he talks about this and many other things. It's stories and tales from the boardroom table. And that's one that he talks about in there: worst case, best case, and what I can live with. And actually, in the military context, that is something that we used to always used to do. It used to be called the estimate. And three elements of that estimate would be, asking, what those three questions are and the outcomes, and making assumptions on them as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to conclude by finishing off my story from the beginning. So the platoon that was deployed to Banshee, so this southern forward operating base in Afghanistan, the most southern, soon realized that the name was so apt. Being the most southern coalition, forward operating base in Afghanistan at the time, it meant that there was no coalition force any further south. We were the most southern. And as a result, the Taliban had pretty much free reign. They would, bring in their new Taliban fighters in through the south, and then they would infiltrate up into the north and obviously get up to all sorts of heinous things. But it also meant that the first coalition force they met was the soldiers in this FOB Banshee. So if you recall, I said that we took over from the USMC, and that was about a company's worth of men and ladies. There were about 90 soldiers, and we replaced it with around about 35 to 40 soldiers, a platoon. And it meant that as the Taliban were coming through, they were attacking this FOB every day. And it was almost like their training ground, where new fighters would come in and attack the base on a daily basis. Now, the soldiers there were based there for 6 months, and they had to deal with daily high pressure and stress situations. You can imagine that each and every day, you knew you were going to get attacked, and sometimes you just didn't know when. Now, I spent time down in Banshee with the soldiers, and one thing that I can say that pressure was relentless, yet the morale was so high. Now, the reason that is because these young soldiers managed to handle that exposure to pressure over such a long period of time. And that was because their leaders and commanders were well versed and understood the impacts of exposure to pressure. They knew how to lead their troops. They knew how to recognize and signpost if a soldier was having some challenges on the pressure. And we had a thing in the military called TRIM, trauma risk management. So over time, the soldiers were able to adapt and have that the clarity to react as they needed to react. to be able to deal with that pressure over a prolonged period of time. And I think for many reasons, it's probably why, for me, when this all kicked off, that I was able to adapt and deal with, the pressure of going into lockdown and many businesses closing down. Indeed, the clients that I was working with at the time, and immediately get into an area of how do we deal with this crisis? What is it that we need to do next? So I think the message from today is pressure is really the thoughts that you have and how you respond to that situation. And it's really starting to program your mind, your subconscious, that you can manage that pressure in a different way. And let me tell you, if young soldiers, and these were young soldiers, some were as young as 18, 19 years old, they weren't leaders in industry, but if they can deal with this prolonged pressure over 6 months, and in fairness, when they come out, there are decompressions and there's lots of stuff that we do afterwards to help them with that. But if they can deal with that prolonged pressure and still have such a collective and individual high performance day in, day out, ladies and gentlemen, I know that that's what we can do out here. And I know it's what I focus on in my high performance coaching, to help people actually deal with this pressure. Because as I said at the beginning, whether you're looking at that attack dog or whether you're looking at that water obstacle on the golf course, the pressure turns up, that interference turns up, and and physiologically the same way regardless. I hope this has been a useful use of your time, and that I've delivered on what I said I would deliver on. What I would ask, if you really wouldn't mind, and that you have found some value on this one, maybe please just pop up onto my LinkedIn profile and drop us maybe a quick recommendation on there, or indeed a Google recommendation that other people would happily maybe encourage them to jump on. I've got a whole business booster series that we're running at the moment. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to leave it there and look forward to catching up the other side of lockdown. Thanks a lot.